Hi, well, thanks for coming here, especially at such a late time of the day, but since it's the last session, I guess you can enjoy the open sessions and maybe some beer afterwards. So I'm going to talk about Jakarta NoSQL, which is the first brand new specification for Jakarta EE that hasn't been part of Java EE before. A little bit about myself. I'm involved in many open source communities. I've been to EclipseCon Europe even before it was called EclipseCon, when it was still called Eclipse Summit Europe, I believe, or Eclipse Forum. And I've also been a member of the executive committee of the JCP and involved in many GSRs. I'm a maintenance lead of the Money GSR and the Unit of Measurement GSR. And I'm also the committer member in the Jakarta EE specification committee. So, how many of you use NoSQL databases? More than one, or just one particular type? Yeah, so there are several different types of NoSQL databases. One is key value, where Redis, Hazelcast, or Amazon would be the most popular examples. Then there are column-based types of NoSQL systems like Cassandra, DynamoDB, or HBase. This one is actually sort of closest to the traditional relational database model. Then there are document-based, like Couchbase, CouchDB, or MongoDB, which are usually based on documents, primarily JSON, sometimes also XML or just plain text. And graph-based systems, like Neo4j. As well as what you call multi-model, where you can choose between multiple representations even within the same system. So those of you who mentioned they were already using or experimenting, in which of these categories does your system fall? Document? Okay, so almost any. Anybody uses anything other than document? Okay, I guess not so many. So here, again, a couple of differences between SQL and NoSQL. As you can see, one challenge, and that's also something that the specification will definitely have a little more work to do, is to find a common denominator. I guess, Eva, for example, you know how long it took to find certain terms in the security API, and that only had one particular type of domain or objects to deal with. So here we actually have 4 to 5 different types of database families, and some of them share common terms, others share completely different terms. So of course it will be a little challenging, and that's also something where the formal specification process is something where we hope to find common denominator, even if it may take a little while. But I guess it may already take till at least Jakarta EE 10 before it can enter the platform. So in a relational database, you would usually have JPA on top of JDBC, and then your actual database. With NoSQL systems, there are plenty of different APIs, most of them vendor specific, so there's no real abstraction. There are several differences where JPA does not work that well, although as we'll see soon, there are some existing frameworks that try to access NoSQL systems via JPA, but there are certain differences that do not make them the most natural match. Current solutions, as already mentioned, Hibernate has an OGM module, which is, it applies JPA more or less and allows to use it on top of common NoSQL systems. And Eclipse Link, formerly TopLink, also has a NoSQL module. Although I believe that's also been around for a while, and from what I read, you actually need to use the Java connector architecture. So it's not so natural, especially if you just want your fat jar and you want to run a system like, I don't know, Eclipse Microprofile or Spring Boot, using NoSQL systems with Eclipse Link and having to install and configure the Java connector architecture is probably not the most common thing that everybody knows how to do. So that's why Jakarta NoSQL aims at a new approach, which we may find certain common parts with JPA in the future, but as such, it does not intend to use JPA completely. So here you see the spec part under Jakarta NoSQL, and the project that was already there, Eclipse JNoSQL, is what you would call the reference implementation or the compatible implementation. As in Jakarta EE, there's no official reference implementation, but there has to be at least one, and that first implementation is Eclipse JNoSQL. It offers a communication layer and a mapping layer for particular types like document, key value, column, or graph. Especially for graph, it makes use of other established solutions, especially Apache Tinkerpop. So here, again, there's a little bit of terminology for some of the APIs that are out there by vendors, showing how they sometimes call things a little different. And this is only document-based, by the way. So that's why for document and also for the other types, Jakarta NoSQL tries to summarize and subsidize them via a common term. In this particular case, it also tries to borrow a few terms from JPA, like the entity. In this case, it's the document entity. And then there are drivers for each particular system that allows mapping them to either of these vendors, depending on the NoSQL system that you're using. There's also a little bit of diversity where if a particular system like Cassandra offers special features that only make sense in the context of Cassandra, then we also allow a few extras that only work with Cassandra. So if you want to migrate between different systems or use multiple types of NoSQL systems at the same time from one application, then of course you may want to use only the common operations. But if you want to use something that's optimized, for example, for Cassandra, you can also do that. For the mapping layer, we use CDI. And there's also support for bean validation, similar to how you could do in your entities based on JPA. So here's an example of entity and columns for the column-based NoSQL system. In this case, they actually look very similar to how you may know that from traditional JPA, which is one of the reasons why people on the mailing list and in community discussion also suggested whether it may be possible to somehow take a piece of JPA out as a common layer. For example, actually, I think it was even called Jakarta Commons once, but the Apache Commons has similar libraries. I believe they're called DBCB or something like that. So it's a sort of abstraction layer, and Spring Data also does something similar, which brings us to another approach. That's something that's very commonly known in Spring Data, the so-called template. So for almost all of the types, except for example for bucket is something that only makes sense in the context of key value, but template and the repository work for almost all of them. So there are specialized templates that have some very common operations like insert or update in common. So that the insert or update are common to every template. And then there are templates that are specific to the document type, which are then extended by, for example, a template for MongoDB. The repository pattern is also something that Spring Data uses quite a lot. And it is something that theoretically, since Spring Data also works for both NoSQL and SQL systems, under ideal circumstances, we could somehow find a Jakarta persistence common or whatever it's called as a layer that works for both SQL and NoSQL, and something like the repository pattern could probably even be applied in the way that it works for both NoSQL and for a future JPA standard, if the JPA spec and project also agree and find that appropriate for their needs. Here's the bucket, which is specific to key value. Now, I'm going to show each of those in the demo, and if there's enough time, we can also take a look into the code in a little more detail if you want. There's also something that is similar to the prepared statements and native queries in traditional relational SQL. Here again, you see that certain elements like the prepared statement work almost the same as in JPA. So if something could be found that works across the two different boundaries, and for example, Hibernate OGM is a good example where they also applied a lot of JPA for the NoSQL world. So if based on the experience that those frameworks already made use of JPA, we could also find something like an abstraction layer, then ideally it would be even easier for you as developers or for your applications, because you would not need to change so much if you want to change, for example, from an Oracle database to a NoSQL system or vice versa. Okay. Drag this over to the second screen. Guess I don't see it now. So works. It didn't work in the test room, I guess. Doesn't work to mirror it. No. Yeah. Try to make this a little bigger. Or can you see it in the back, or is it too small, the font? Okay. Control Shift on the Mac. It's Windows. Yeah. Control Shift. Yes. No. Yep. Still larger? Okay. Is that okay? Yeah. So the first one is an example for the document template using MongoDB. I guess it will not. I will have to see how. I believe it only zooms the editor and not the content. No, the content also looks quite nice. So actually the interesting part is only the output in black. As I said, the demos are relatively short and brief, each of them, but since we have at least about 10 more minutes, I guess if you're interested, I can show you in each of them which of the API elements they use. So this one was an example for a template in the document-based system using MongoDB. So in this case, for the sake of simplicity, the only one that I use that requires an external database and not an embedded system in memory is MongoDB, because I have MongoDB already on my system from a prior project. All the others basically have the database in memory, like Hazelcast and Neo4j. There are two different drivers. One is for a remote Neo4j system, and the other one is also for in-memory, but I'm going to show only the in-memory one. Okay, so the second one uses the repository, as you can see. And this one should be Hazelcast. Yeah. Again, there's a lot of boilerplate from the logging, especially Hazelcast. Even in the local in-memory mode, behaves almost as if it was in a cluster. Of course, you could also use it in the cluster, but here we only have the local system. And yeah, we have replaced one user and then we look up one user. Now take a look at the code again. So we take the user repository. We have created a user via a builder. But the user is actually just a Pocho. We save the user in the repository. And then we look it up by its ID. So very simple, but here for the sake of simplicity, it shows how to use the repository pattern and the repository API element. Again, the repository also works so you can use the template with key value, and you can use the repository for document. So there are two, and if you include others like buckets that are specific to key value, 3 or more different ways to access certain types of databases. But some of them, especially the template and the repository, work across all the different systems. Others are specific, especially with the graph-based. We will also see that graph is a little different because there can be more operations done to the graph, for example, connecting them to each other. So here we have the bucket also on top of Hefecast. The user? Yeah. From the last one. Yeah. Okay. So the user in this case is just a Pocho. With the annotation. So it's similar to JPA, and as mentioned, if there could be some sort of common layer, it would be quite beneficial because, for example, for a client some years ago, we also created a Pocho that is both annotated with JPA and with something that you can now find in Jackson or in the JSON binding spec. So the same class was annotated with multiple different annotations, and depending on how you wanted to persist it, you could persist it either as a JSON file or into the database. And I think we even added some custom persistence mechanism that would allow it to be stored in a Microsoft Excel sheet. Although, please don't ask me about that. It was something, I think it was using Apache Poi or some framework. So it's probably not the most common way, but in this case, we did a 3-way persistence mechanism. And so here, ideally, if it was possible to reuse certain entity or ID or other annotations that they work both with NoSQL and SQL, then of course it would be possible. You would just have to configure the underlying persistence mechanism, and then your system would know whether it should be using a NoSQL or a SQL database. No, right now they're not, because it's not directly, so it's in the Jakarta NoSQL. That's right. The challenge would then be to find something. So once Java X persistence, which is currently still in the old namespace, once this is moved, maybe we could find something to either reuse it. So as soon as JPA also moves to Jakarta, we could try to negotiate a common ground that allows both of them to use the same annotation. Otherwise, you would have to have like Java Jakarta.persistence.entity and Jakarta.NoSQL.entity. It would also work, but it would be a little ugly. Okay, so we have 10 more minutes. We're quite good in time. So now let's come to something a little more fancy in a graph-based system. So here it also uses a template, but on top of a graph-based system. And you already see that the graph allows things that you did not see in the others because it's specific to graph-based systems like edge, and you can also connect them with each other. And a few other specific things like a vertex. There we go. So that's using Neo4j in memory. All of this, by the way, use CDI2 in the SE mode. So you don't need a standalone container. And then we have one more that also shows the relations between the employees, or the persons in this case. So here we see again the person is also a cultural that's annotated. And this application, most of those employees seem to be inspired by the Avengers a little bit. And then here you see on the edges that certain persons are related to each other. For example, they know about each other, or they're in love with each other. This is using the graph database Python. Yeah, so there are a few warnings here from the system itself, but basically the last couple of lines here are the result of the query. So developers with a salary greater than $3,000. I guess that may not really apply to Tony Stark. Although, of course, it only says that he makes more than $3,000. It doesn't say how much he actually earns. And the last line with the Valentine's Day basically shows the persons that are related by being in love with each other. Okay, guess we have maybe a little more time for Q&A, but yeah, so we switch back. Yeah, several providers and systems already are supported. Most of them were already supported before it incubated in Jakarta EE. There are also a couple of independent vendors that created drivers. For example, in communities like GitHub, you find certain drivers that were created directly by vendors outside of NoSQL. Here are a couple of references. The ones in black refer to the Jakarta NoSQL spec. except the NoSQL org page at the moment, because Jakarta EE right now only covers the specs that are final in Jakarta EE8. So until eventually it may also become part of the Jakarta EE platform, the NoSQL org website shows both the spec and the implementation. So it's a shortcut that will also allow you to find all the necessary GitHub repos, including this demo. There are two mailing lists, although this sound very similar, but the first one, the NoSQL, is for the NoSQL spec. And the second one, the NoSQL dev, is for the implementation. You can subscribe to both. There's also a Gitter, chat, and forum, and an Eclipse wiki. Okay, by the way, I'm not sure if any of you are also members of the Java community process, but because Iva now has other duties and he was no longer able to serve, at least as an associate member, and because there are certain aspects of Jakarta EE, especially with regards to existing JCP specs, for example, the portlet spec that uses the current Java EE. And there are things that basically need to be clarified. For example, could a future version of the portlet spec still exist under the JCP? And if so, could it use Jakarta EE, or does it also have to migrate to Jakarta EE? So since I have quite a lot of experience in both areas, I also offer that experience, and I'm running for an associate seat in the JCP Executive Committee. So should any of you be associate members of the JCP and you're happy to vote, then I would be happy if some of you voted for me. There also, by the way, the Chuck logo is the Utrecht Chuck, because they also run in the associate category. But for example, iChuck, who's also one of the sponsors here, they also run in the other category. So there's two different categories that you can vote depending on your membership, if you are a member of the JCP. Okay, so I think maybe there's one question. Yes?
How do you upload Lua scripts for Redis database to the framework?
Scripts in, you mean like the query?
That's Redis. If you're doing Redis database things, you can upload Lua scripts.
Lua?
Yeah.
I think at the moment, I think at the moment there are, of course, native SQL-like scripts, but I don't think we currently support Lua there. But if it's possible to use Lua in the same way to, for example, I showed you this prepared statement. If the prepared statement API element was capable of interpreting Lua, then I guess in theory this could be done via this prepared statement, similar to what the SQL or SQL-like statements do right now. It's not implemented yet, but I think it could be done like that. If you identify such feature, then please just share it on the mailing list or on the GitHub issue tracker as a possible enhancement request. We very much welcome such suggestions. Any other question, suggestion? No. I know there's also a cloud native town hall, and I guess since it has something to do with Jakarta EE, I plan to also be there at least for the first half of it. So if you have further questions and something comes to your mind, then please come there after the beer and food, if you still want. And I think for now, we are done. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the evening.